Welcome back to Mad Minds, where we don't just tell stories, we awaken the ones buried in silence. Imagine a city of tens of thousands where streets ran in perfect order, where water flowed through carefully built channels, and where silence itself was once filled with the hum of life. Then, one day, gone. No armies at the gate, no flames in the night, no cries of despair. A city erased not by sword or fire, but by silence. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment with what we should explore next. The Indus River moves like a patient serpent through the sun-scorched plains of what we now call Pakistan, its waters carrying the memory of civilizations that rose and fell along its banks like the endless rhythm of seasons. Along those fertile shores, nearly 5,000 years ago, when the world was younger and the gods still walked close enough to cast shadows, a city began to rise, not born from conquest or the fevered dreams of kings drunk on power, but from something rarer, something more dangerous: vision. A city that would, in time, become the beating heart of one of humanity's first great experiments in organized civilization, a place where order was not imposed by the sword but grew naturally from the understanding that survival required more than individual strength. It demanded collective wisdom. Its name, at least the one we give it now in our ignorance, was Mohenjo-Daro, the Mound of the Dead. But it was not born in death, despite the title that clings to its ruins like grave dust. It was born in triumph, in the radical belief that mortals could build something worthy of permanence, in the dangerous faith that human hands, guided by human minds, could create order from the chaos that had ruled the world since time began. When you walk through what remains today, beneath the searing sun that beats down on stones that once knew shade, it seems unremarkable at first glance. Just another archaeological site where tourists take photographs and graduate students measure pottery shards with the obsessive precision of those who hope that enough small truths might eventually add up to one large understanding. Low walls crumbling back into the earth that birthed them. Bricks the color of dried blood and rusted dreams. Outlines of homes and streets half swallowed by millennia of patient sand. The skeleton of something magnificent, picked clean by time and weather, and the relentless hunger of entropy. But if you let the silence breathe around you, if you close your eyes and allow imagination to fill the spaces where history has grown thin, the dust begins to whisper. The broken stones remember their purpose, and you can almost hear the echo of what this place once was. Once, these ruins pulsed with the lives of tens of thousands of souls, a city that existed not as accident or afterthought, but as conscious creation, laid out not in the organic chaos that characterized most ancient settlements, but in patterns that spoke of minds that thought in terms of generations rather than seasons. Streets that stretched like the veins of some vast organism, wide enough for carts and crowds, aligned with mathematical precision that would make modern urban planners weep with envy. A grid system so perfect, so deliberately planned, that it seemed as though the earth itself had been measured and marked with invisible strings, guided by hands that understood geometry as a sacred language. As if the builders had learned to read the secret harmonies that govern how space and human need could be married into something that transcended both. Houses rose side by side in disciplined rows, each one built with uniform bricks that spoke of standards maintained across decades of construction. Every brick the same size, the same weight, the same reddish hue that came from clay, fired in kilns whose temperatures were controlled with the precision of artisans who understood that consistency was the foundation upon which permanence could be built. The masons who laid those bricks followed commands that were never written down, but were somehow transmitted from hand to hand, mind to mind, generation to generation, as though they were obeying a code written not in stone or papyrus, but in the very bones of their civilization. A shared understanding of how things should be done that required no enforcement, because it had become as natural as breathing. Brick by brick, block by block, they were building more than shelter. They were building a statement about what mortals could achieve when individual ambition surrendered to collective vision, when the hunger for personal glory stepped aside to make room for something larger, something that could outlast any single life or single generation. Water was everywhere, not hoarded in palace cisterns or temple pools, but democratically distributed through a network of wells that numbered in the thousands. Imagine the revolutionary nature of that decision. While most of the ancient world organized itself around the scarcity of clean water, around the power that came from controlling access to life's most basic necessity, Mohenjo-Daro bent water to the will of all its citizens. Every neighborhood, every street, every humble dwelling had access to wells that reached down into aquifers that seemed inexhaustible. The city had solved one of humanity's oldest problems through engineering that made survival a shared blessing rather than a privilege reserved for those with the strength to seize it. And then there was the Great Bath, a structure so magnificent, so purposeful, so heavy with implications that archaeologists still debate its meaning, like theologians arguing over sacred texts. A vast public space built of fired brick and sealed with bitumen that had traveled thousands of miles to serve this single purpose. Its walls descended in perfect steps to a sunken pool that reflected light like a mirror made of liquid shadow. Wide staircases stretched down on either side, leading into water that was still and dark and somehow expectant, as if it were waiting for ceremonies that had been interrupted rather than concluded. Was it for cleansing bodies that carried the dust and sweat of daily labor? Was it for worship of gods whose names have been erased from human memory? Was it for rituals that connected the individual soul to forces larger than individual understanding? No one can say with certainty. The builders left no explanations carved in stone, no instruction manuals for future archaeologists to puzzle over. But when you stand before it today, when you stare into depths that no longer hold water, but somehow still hold mystery, you can almost hear the faint echo of splashes that disturbed surfaces that reflected more than sky. The hushed chants of voices raised in languages that have been dead for millennia. The weight of something sacred pressing into air that modern lungs struggle to breathe. The presence of ceremonies that transformed ordinary water into something that could wash away more than physical dirt. This was not a city built by accident or assembled through the random accumulation of structures that served immediate needs, without regard for larger purpose. This was a city of foresight, of planning that extended beyond the lifetime of any single planner, of minds that thought in terms of centuries rather than years, of civilizations rather than kingdoms. Granaries rose like temples dedicated to the worship of preparation, their thick walls designed to guard grain against famine, drought, and the thousand natural disasters that could transform abundance into starvation overnight. Storage systems that could sustain the population through seasons of scarcity, through years when the river ran low, or the monsoons failed to arrive, or the gods turned their attention elsewhere. Beneath the streets, hidden from sight but essential to the city's health, drainage channels carried away the waste that could turn paradise into plague ground. Covered by stone slabs so carefully fitted that the air remained pure even when the channels ran full. A sewer system more sophisticated than what most cities would achieve for the next 3,000 years. Infrastructure that understood the connection between sanitation and survival, between public health and private prosperity. Order and rhythm pulsed through every corner of the city like the heartbeat of something that had learned to live in harmony with forces larger than human ambition. Every street served a purpose. Every building contributed to a larger design. Every citizen was part of a system that worked because everyone understood their role in maintaining something greater than themselves. And yet, for all its brilliance, for all its achievements that wouldn't be matched for millennia, for all its proof that human cooperation could create wonders that individual genius could never imagine, Mohenjo-Daro left almost nothing of itself behind that could explain who these people really were. No palaces carved with the names of kings who demanded immortality through stone monuments. No ziggurats screaming the glory of gods who required blood sacrifice and golden tribute. No towering statues that commanded devotion through the raw intimidation of size and expense. No libraries filled with scrolls that preserved the conversations of philosophers and the calculations of mathematicians. No royal tombs stuffed with treasures that could guide archaeologists toward understanding how power moved through their society. Only the city itself remains, a body without a face, a voice without words that modern ears can understand. A civilization that achieved greatness through methods so different from every other great civilization that we struggle to recognize greatness when it doesn't wear the familiar clothes of conquest and monument building. When British archaeologists rediscovered Mohenjo-Daro in the 1920s, when they brushed away millennia of accumulated sand and revealed streets that ran straighter than most modern cities could manage, they found walls and bones, baths and drainage systems that put contemporary urban planning to shame. But they did not find answers. They found only better questions. Who ruled here, and how did their authority function without the palaces and throne rooms that characterized every other ancient civilization? How did they live, and what principles guided their daily decisions when those principles were never written down in law codes that survived the centuries? What words did they speak to each other, and what ideas did those words carry when they gathered in the Great Bath or conducted business in markets whose organization we can map, but whose purposes remain mysterious? The script they carved into tiny seals, thousands of symbols that clearly carried meaning, that obviously served important functions in their economic and religious life, remains undeciphered to this day, locked tight like secrets whispered behind doors that time has sealed shut, like messages written in a language that died so completely that even the memory of how to read it has been erased from human understanding. So, Mohenjo-Daro lives in our histories as both miracle and riddle, as proof of human capability and reminder of human limitation. Older than Athens, where philosophy learned to walk upright. Older than Rome, where empire learned to speak Latin. Older than nearly every civilization we call the foundation of human greatness. And yet, for all its sophistication, for all its evidence of minds that could think in terms of urban planning and public health and collective welfare, it did not last. It could not preserve itself against whatever forces finally claimed it. Because one day, this miracle built from brick and vision and the revolutionary idea that cities could be planned rather than simply accumulated, simply died. Not in war that left the scars of battle carved into broken walls, not in fire that left layers of ash for future archaeologists to read like the final chapters of a tragic story, but in silence, complete, mysterious, inexplicable silence, the kind of ending that leaves no explanations, no final words, no closing arguments, just absence where presence used to be, just questions where answers used to live, just dust where dreams used to breathe. Oh, understand the magnitude of what was lost when Mohenjo-Daro fell silent. We must step back from the ruins of individual cities and see the vast organism of which they were merely the most visible organs. The Indus Valley Civilization, a cultural heartbeat that stretched across what we now call Pakistan and northwestern India. A network of connected cities that thrived for nearly 1,000 years, longer than the Roman Empire, longer than most dynasties, longer than most human experiments in organized society have any right to expect. It spread like the pulse of something alive across landscapes that modern borders have artificially divided, connecting communities that were separated by hundreds of miles of desert and river and mountain, but united by shared understanding of how civilization should function. Cities like Harappa, whose discovery gave the entire culture its archaeological name, Lothal, whose docks could accommodate ships that carried trade goods across oceans to markets in Mesopotamia, Dolavira, whose water conservation systems demonstrated that engineering could transform even the most challenging environments into places where human communities could flourish, all of them rising alongside Mohenjo-Daro like notes in a symphony that had learned to harmonize across impossible distances, bound together not by the chains of conquest that held other empires together, but by something more subtle, more durable, more revolutionary, shared vision. While much of the world still organized itself around the simple logic of tribal warfare, where strength determined survival and survival determined the right to exist, the Indus Valley peoples had discovered something that wouldn't be rediscovered for millennia. They had learned to build in harmony with river, soil, and sky. to work with natural forces rather than against them, to see the landscape not as enemy territory to be conquered and subdued, but as partner in the great project of creating sustainable civilization. They did not raise pyramids that served no purpose except to announce the immortality of kings who were already dead. They did not construct ziggurats that existed primarily to remind ordinary mortals of their insignificance compared to gods who demanded constant tribute and sacrifice. Their monuments were the cities themselves. Their pyramids were the houses where families raised children who grew up assuming that clean water and efficient drainage and wide streets were the natural birthright of anyone born into human community. Their temples were the public baths where individual bodies were cleansed as part of rituals that cleansed the collective soul. Their ziggurats were the granaries that stored grain, not for the exclusive use of priestly classes, but for the survival of entire populations when harvests failed or rivers changed course or the gods decided to test human resilience. And perhaps that is the strangest thing about them, the detail that makes them most alien to modern minds trained to understand power in terms of hierarchy, dominance, and the individual accumulation of resources that can be converted into influence over other people's lives. For all their evident sophistication, for all their technological achievements that wouldn't be matched for thousands of years, for all their proof that they had solved problems of urban planning and public health that still challenge contemporary cities, there is little sign of the kinds of rulers that characterized every other ancient civilization. No thrones carved from precious stone and decorated with the symbols of absolute authority. No colossal tombs stuffed with treasures that would accompany dead kings into whatever realms awaited them. No statues the size of mountains that commanded worship through the raw intimidation of scale. No palaces whose size and expense served primarily to remind visitors that some humans had transcended the limitations that constrained ordinary mortals. Power here was not loud. It was silent, hidden, diffused like water flowing through channels that served the entire system rather than accumulating in reservoirs that served individual ambition, distributed like light that illuminated everything rather than concentrated like fire that burned with the intensity of suns but left everything else in darkness. Some scholars believe that priests ruled quietly, maintaining order not through the threat of violence that kept other civilizations stable, but through rituals that connected individual behavior to cosmic principles that everyone could understand and accept. Spiritual authorities who guided communities through ceremonies that reinforced shared values rather than through laws that imposed external constraints. Leaders whose power came from their ability to interpret the will of gods, who clearly favored cooperation over competition, harmony over dominance, collective welfare over individual accumulation. Rulers who understood that the most durable form of authority comes not from forcing obedience, but from creating conditions where obedience becomes unnecessary because everyone understands their role in maintaining something larger than themselves. Others suggest something even more revolutionary, that this was a society that had somehow learned to function without traditional rulers at all, a civilization where the city itself was the temple, where the community was the congregation, where the street was the prayer, and the well was the altar, where power was so completely distributed that no individual or class could accumulate enough authority to reshape the entire system according to personal preference, where decisions emerged from consensus rather than being imposed from above, where leadership was temporary and functional rather than permanent and ceremonial, an experiment in human organization that anticipated discoveries about collective intelligence and distributed authority that we think of as modern innovations. Their genius lay in achievements that other civilizations would not master for centuries, if they ever mastered them at all. Urban planning that treated cities as integrated systems rather than collections of individual structures. Sanitation engineering that understood the connections between public health and private welfare. Social organization that somehow achieved equality of access to basic necessities without sacrificing the efficiency that comes from specialization and coordination. Each home, whether it housed merchants or artisans or laborers or whatever other categories their society recognized, was connected to the same drainage system that served the entire city. Each neighborhood had equal access to wells that reached down to aquifers that belonged to everyone and no one. Water didn't flow to palaces first and commoners second. Waste disposal didn't favor the wealthy and ignore the poor. The basic infrastructure of civilization served everyone with the same efficiency, the same reliability, the same assumption that all citizens deserved access to the technologies that made urban life possible. It was not chaos held together by the accident of temporary stability. It was balance, conscious, deliberate, maintained through principles that understood individual welfare and collective welfare as two aspects of the same fundamental reality. But their influence extended far beyond the rivers and plains, where their cities rose like geometric poems written in brick and stone. Their hands reached across deserts and seas to touch civilizations that existed thousands of miles from their home territories. They established trade networks that connected the Indus Valley to Mesopotamia, sending cotton and beads and crafted goods in exchange for metals and precious stones and luxury items that their own environment couldn't provide. Seals carved with their undeciphered script have been found in Babylonian ruins, proof that Indus Valley merchants walked the streets of cities whose names we know from cuneiform tablets. Evidence that their trade goods were valued highly enough to justify the enormous expense and risk of transporting them across landscapes that could kill the unprepared. Testimony that their civilization was integrated into the economic networks that connected all the major centers of early human culture. The hum of their markets traveled across continents, carrying not just goods, but ideas, technologies, artistic influences that enriched every culture they touched. This was their golden age, a time when the Indus Valley shone not through the reflected glory of conquest and monument building, not through the accumulated treasures of exploitation and tribute, but through the quiet mastery of life itself, through the revolutionary demonstration that human communities could be organized according to principles of cooperation rather than competition, through the patient proof that civilization could be built to last, could be designed to serve everyone, could be maintained through wisdom rather than force. 1,000 years of evidence that mortals could create something worthy of the gods' attention without requiring the gods' direct intervention to keep it functioning. And yet, even as they reached the peak of their achievements, even as their cities hummed with the contentment that comes from systems that work efficiently and fairly, golden ages carry their own curse. Success plants the seeds of its own destruction, because power, even quiet power distributed through entire populations rather than concentrated in individual hands, always casts shadows. And in Mohenjo-Daro, in the geometric perfection of streets that had known order for centuries, in the reliable flow of water through wells that had never run dry, that shadow was beginning to stir. Not dramatically, not with the obvious threat of foreign armies or internal rebellion, but with the subtle menace of forces that civilizations cannot control through planning or engineering or the careful distribution of authority. Forces that operate according to scales of time and geography that make human achievements seem like temporary arrangements, like sandcastles built between tides, the shadow of change itself, of the natural world's refusal to remain stable just because human communities needed stability to survive, of the cosmic indifference that reduces all human plans to temporary expedients, all human achievements to archaeological puzzles. The shadow that reminds every civilization, no matter how successful, that permanence is an illusion, and adaptation is the only law that governs survival in a universe that was never designed to make survival easy. Something changed. Not gradually, like the slow accumulation of small problems that eventually add up to systemic crisis. Not obviously, like the arrival of foreign armies, or the outbreak of civil war, or the emergence of new technologies that make old ways of life obsolete, but suddenly, mysteriously, with the kind of shift that transforms stability into catastrophe before anyone realizes that the foundations have cracked. Perhaps it began with the river itself, the Indus that had been the city's liquid lifeline for centuries, the watery highway that connected Mohenjo-Daro to trading partners and sister cities scattered across the valley like jewels on a necklace made of flowing water. A river is both creator and destroyer, both mother and executioner. It gives life with one hand while preparing to take it away with the other. It nourishes civilizations for centuries, teaching them to depend on its generosity, convincing them that its patterns are permanent, then changes course overnight, abandoning its children like a god who has grown bored with worship. The Indus was never a tame river, never a waterway that could be controlled through human engineering or predicted through human observation. It rose from mountains where snow melted, according to schedules that depended on weather patterns that operated according to forces larger than any earthly civilization could influence or understand. It could flood without warning, turning fertile fields into inland seas that drowned crops and homes with equal indifference. It could retreat just as suddenly, leaving irrigation channels dry and wells empty, transforming abundance into scarcity faster than human communities could adapt their expectations. It could shift its course entirely, following new channels carved by the chaos of seasonal flooding, abandoning cities that had been built on the assumption that water would always flow where it had always flowed. The river that had given life to Mohenjo-Daro for nearly 1,000 years may have simply decided to flow elsewhere, leaving behind only dry channels that testified to the impermanence of even the most fundamental geographical features. Imagine the terror of watching your civilization's liquid foundation disappear, of waking up one morning to discover that wells which had never failed were drawing up only sand, of seeing fields that had fed tens of thousands of people crack and harden into surfaces that could grow nothing except despair. Or perhaps the betrayal came from above rather than beside, from skies that had delivered life-sustaining monsoons for generations, then turned against the people who had learned to depend on their reliability. Climate is even less predictable than rivers, even less concerned with human needs than geographical features. It operates according to planetary cycles that make civilizations seem like brief experiments, temporary arrangements that exist at the pleasure of forces that have no interest in their success or failure. Archaeologists have found evidence in lake beds and tree rings and ice cores that suggests the climate of the Indus Valley shifted dramatically around the time that Mohenjo-Daro began its final decline. Monsoon patterns that had sustained agriculture for centuries simply stopped arriving on schedule. Rain that had fallen regularly enough to support urban populations in the tens of thousands simply failed to appear when and where it was needed. Skies that had been reliably generous became capriciously stingy, rationing moisture like a miser counting coins. The delicate balance between rainfall and evaporation, between seasonal flooding and seasonal drought, tipped toward conditions that made large-scale agriculture impossible. Imagine the psychological impact of watching the sky betray you, of performing the same agricultural rituals that had worked for your parents and grandparents and great-grandparents, only to discover that the gods who had answered those rituals for generations were no longer listening, of realizing that the climate that had made your civilization possible was transforming into something that made your civilization impossible. But while environmental explanations might account for gradual decline, for the slow abandonment of cities that could no longer sustain their populations, they don't explain the evidence that archaeologists found when they carefully excavated the final layers of Mohenjo-Daro's existence, evidence that suggests the end came not gradually, but suddenly, not through the patient erosion of environmental disaster, but through something immediate, violent, final. When the city was first unearthed by British archaeologists in the 1920s, they found something that contradicted all their expectations about how ancient civilizations typically met their ends. Skeletons scattered in streets that showed no signs of battle. Bodies lying as though death had swept through the city in a single wave, claiming victims so quickly they had no time to seek shelter, no opportunity to organize resistance, no chance to flee towards safety that might have existed beyond the city walls. Men, women, children, lying where they fell, some with arms outstretched as if reaching for help that never came, others huddled together in family groups, as if proximity to loved ones could somehow protect against whatever force was claiming their lives, scattered randomly through streets that bore no marks of siege warfare, in buildings that showed no signs of fire or structural collapse. But here's the detail that transforms archaeological puzzle into genuine mystery. There were no signs of invasion, no arrowheads embedded in walls or bones, no layers of ash that would indicate the city had been burned by conquering armies, no toppled defensive walls or broken gates that would suggest the city had fallen to military assault, no evidence of the kind of systematic destruction that characterized the conquest of every other major ancient city. The bodies lay where they had fallen, but they hadn't fallen in battle. They had simply stopped, as if life had been switched off like a lamp being extinguished, as if some force had moved through the city claiming lives without leaving any trace of its presence except the absence of presence itself. It was as if death had arrived suddenly, silently, invisibly, moving through neighborhoods like fog, touching everyone and everything but leaving no footprints, no fingerprints, no evidence of its method or motive, claiming lives with the efficiency of something that understood exactly how to kill without bothering to announce its intentions or explain its reasons. Disease offers one possible explanation: a plague that moved through the population faster than anyone could understand what was happening, let alone organize effective resistance. Epidemic disease can kill entire cities in a matter of days or weeks, spreading through water supplies or carried by rats, or transmitted through the very air that people breathe. It requires no army, leaves no weapons, burns no buildings, but it can empty a city as effectively as any military conquest. The Black Death would demonstrate centuries later how quickly disease could transform thriving communities into ghost towns, how mortality could arrive without warning and depart without explanation, leaving only corpses and questions. Perhaps some pathogen, bacteria or virus or parasite that the Indus Valley civilization had no experience fighting, found its way into Mohenjo-Daro's water supply or food distribution system. Perhaps their sophisticated urban planning, their pride in connecting every neighborhood to shared wells and drainage systems, became the very mechanism through which death spread from house to house, street to street, district to district. Perhaps the interconnectedness that had made their civilization efficient also made it vulnerable. Perhaps what killed them was precisely what had made them great: the assumption that sharing resources was always safer than hoarding them, that collective systems were always more reliable than individual preparations. But violence offers another explanation, not the organized violence of foreign invasion, but the chaotic violence of internal collapse, of communities turning against themselves when environmental stress made cooperation impossible and survival seemed to require competition. When rivers change course and rains fail and granaries empty, even the most cooperative societies can fragment into competing factions. When resources become scarce and futures become uncertain, even people who have lived together peacefully for generations can discover that desperation makes enemies of friends. When survival itself becomes questionable, the social bonds that hold civilizations together can snap under pressure that they were never designed to bear. Some researchers believe that the scattered bodies in Mohenjo-Daro's streets might be evidence of final, desperate conflicts, not between the city and foreign enemies, but between the city's own inhabitants as they fought over whatever resources remained when their civilization's life support systems began to fail. Perhaps the same people who had shared wells and drainage systems and public baths for centuries turned on each other when sharing became a luxury they could no longer afford. Perhaps the equality that had characterized Indus Valley society became impossible to maintain when there wasn't enough of anything to distribute equally. Perhaps they killed each other over the last grain in the granaries, the last water in the wells, the last hope that someone, somewhere, might survive even if everyone else perished. But whatever explanation eventually proves correct, environmental disaster, epidemic disease, internal violence, or some combination of factors that modern researchers haven't yet imagined, one truth remains inescapable. The silence was not gradual. The end was not a process, but an event. It was abrupt, complete, final. Imagine standing in the great bath one morning, watching the sunrise reflect off water that had witnessed generations of ritual and ceremony, breathing air that carried the familiar sounds of a city awakening to another day of productive activity, and by nightfall, only the wind remains, carrying whispers between empty buildings where echoes bounce off walls that will never again hear human voices. where the only sound is the settling of structures that were built to last for centuries, but will now crumble slowly back into the earth that provided the clay for their bricks, where silence has become so complete that it seems to have weight, substance, presence, as if absence itself had learned to occupy space. The turning point came not like dawn breaking gradually over the horizon, but like a switch being thrown, like a door being slammed, like a conversation being cut off mid-sentence. One moment Mohenjo-Daro was alive, the next moment it was memory. One moment it was civilization, the next moment it was archaeology. One moment it was present, the next moment it was past. And the transition happened so quickly that no one had time to explain what was happening. No one survived to tell the story of how it felt to watch the world end. No one remained to write the final chapter of a civilization that had thrived for nearly 1,000 years. No one lived to answer the questions that archaeologists would ask when they rediscovered the ruins 22 centuries later. Just silence. Complete, mysterious, inexplicable silence. The kind of ending that feels less like conclusion than interruption, less like death than disappearance, less like archaeology than haunting. Mohenjo-Daro did not fall like Troy, with walls cracking under the weight of siege engines and the sky turning orange with the flames of systematic destruction. It did not die like Pompeii, buried under ash that preserved the final moments of daily life in volcanic amber. It did not collapse like Rome, slowly decaying over centuries as barbarians carved away pieces of an empire that had grown too large to defend and too corrupt to reform. It simply stopped, like a heart that forgets how to beat, like a conversation that ends mid-word, like a song that breaks off before the final note. The walls of Mohenjo-Daro bear no marks of siege warfare, no scars from catapults or battering rams, no evidence of the systematic destruction that armies inflict when they want to ensure that conquered cities can never rise again. Its streets carry no layers of ash from fires that would have announced the city's death to anyone within 100 miles. Its buildings show no signs of the deliberate vandalism that conquering forces typically use to erase the symbols of defeated civilizations. The orderly grid of roads remains intact, as if the engineers who designed them had expected their work to be maintained indefinitely. The sophisticated drainage system continues to function even in ruins, testament to construction techniques that anticipated centuries of use. Instead, the city seems to have simply emptied, like water draining from a broken vessel, like air escaping from a punctured lung, like life departing from a body that had forgotten why it needed to remain animated. The wells that had never failed began to draw up only sand and disappointment, their stone-lined depths reflecting light that came from above but led to darkness that extended far below the reach of any rope or bucket. The great bath that had witnessed generations of ritual and ceremony slowly filled with the dust of abandonment, its carefully sealed walls still waterproof but no longer containing anything except emptiness. The houses that had sheltered families for centuries began their patient return to the earth from which their bricks had been shaped, one crumbling wall at a time, one collapsing roof at a time, one forgotten room at a time. Some whisper that it was the Indus itself that delivered the killing blow, the river that had been both mother and deity to the civilization it supported, suddenly changing course with the fickleness of natural forces that operate according to geological rather than human timescales. Rivers are democratic in their indifference. They nourish civilizations for millennia, then abandon them overnight when the landscape shifts or the climate changes, or the mysterious forces that govern the movement of water decide that flow should follow different paths. The same current that had carried trade boats loaded with cotton and beads and crafted goods to markets in Mesopotamia simply began flowing somewhere else, leaving behind only dry channels that testified to the impermanence of even the most fundamental geographical features. Irrigation systems that had been the technological marvel of their age became useless networks of empty canals, like the circulatory system of a body that had lost its blood supply. Fields that had fed tens of thousands of people hardened into surfaces that could support nothing except the hardy desert plants that had waited patiently for their opportunity to reclaim territory that had been temporarily borrowed by human ambition. Others believe the betrayal came from above, from sky gods who had provided the monsoon rains that made large-scale agriculture possible. then simply stopped delivering the precipitation that entire civilizations had learned to depend upon. Climate operates according to planetary cycles that make human civilizations seem like brief experiments in temporary organization. Weather patterns that remain stable for centuries can shift suddenly when ocean currents change temperature or atmospheric pressure systems reorganize themselves according to principles that exist far beyond the reach of human influence or understanding. The delicate balance of seasonal rainfall and seasonal drought that had sustained Indus Valley agriculture for nearly 1,000 years may have tipped toward conditions that made urban populations impossible to support. Skies that had been reliable providers of life-sustaining water may have simply decided to rain elsewhere, leaving behind communities that had never learned to survive without the assumption that the gods would continue to be generous. Granaries that had been built to protect against temporary shortages proved inadequate when shortages became permanent, when the crops that were supposed to refill them season after season simply stopped growing in soil that had forgotten how to be fertile. Still others point to evidence that suggests the end came not through environmental disaster, but through something more immediate, more violent, more inexplicable. Disease, perhaps, a plague so swift and merciless that it moved through the population faster than anyone could understand what was happening, let alone organize effective resistance against an enemy they couldn't see or fight. Epidemic disease requires no army, announces no invasion, leaves no weapons behind, but it can empty cities as effectively as any military conquest, transforming thriving communities into silent graveyards in a matter of days or weeks. The interconnected water systems that had made Mohenjo-Daro a marvel of urban planning may have become the very pathways through which death spread from neighborhood to neighborhood, house to house, family to family. The shared wells and communal baths that had symbolized their civilization's commitment to collective welfare may have become reservoirs of contamination that killed with the same efficiency they had once used to sustain life. Or perhaps internal collapse, the kind of violent disintegration that occurs when environmental stress makes cooperation impossible and survival seems to require the abandonment of every principle that had held society together. When resources become scarce and futures become uncertain, even communities that have lived in harmony for centuries can fragment into competing factions. When the systems that had made prosperity possible begin to fail, people who had shared everything may discover that desperation makes enemies of friends, that hunger makes predators of neighbors. The scattered bodies that archaeologists found in Mohenjo-Daro's streets may be evidence of final, desperate conflicts, not between the city and foreign invaders, but between the city's own inhabitants as they fought over whatever remained when their civilization's life support systems began to break down. But whatever combination of factors ultimately claimed Mohenjo-Daro, environmental catastrophe, epidemic disease, social collapse, or forces that modern researchers have not yet imagined, the pattern of its ending remained consistent with the pattern of its existence. It died as it had lived, without fanfare, without monuments to mark the occasion, without leaving explanations that future generations could read and understand. It died quietly, efficiently, completely. The silence was not gradual, like the slow fade of a conversation that runs out of subjects worth discussing. It was abrupt, like a door slamming shut, like a light being switched off, like a heart stopping between beats, and it was final. So final that for nearly 4,000 years, no human being even remembered that such a place had ever existed. So complete that when British archaeologists finally rediscovered it in the 1920s, they had to invent a name for it because its real name had been lost along with everything else that could have explained who its builders were and what they had been trying to achieve. So thorough that even today, with all our archaeological techniques and linguistic analysis and scientific instruments, we still cannot read their writing, still cannot pronounce their names, still cannot understand the principles that guided their daily decisions. The city that had mastered the art of making civilization sustainable had not mastered the art of making civilization permanent. The people who had solved problems of urban planning and public health that still challenge contemporary societies had not solved the problem of ensuring that their solutions would survive the disappearance of the society that created them. the civilization that had demonstrated how human communities could be organized according to principles of cooperation and equality, had not learned how to pass those principles on to future generations who might have benefited from their wisdom. They had built something magnificent, and then they let it die without explanation, without apology, without leaving instructions for how it could be rebuilt by anyone who might discover its ruins and wonder what lessons could be learned from its achievements and its failures. The wells dried up and filled with sand. The great bath became a reservoir for dust and silence. The houses collapsed brick by brick, returning their materials to the earth from which they had been shaped. The streets where children had played and merchants had conducted business and priests had performed ceremonies gradually disappeared beneath layers of sediment that buried evidence along with memory. And Mohenjo-Daro, the city that had been a miracle of human organization, became exactly what its modern name suggests, a mound of the dead. Not a living community, but an archaeological site. Not a testament to human achievement, but a reminder of human mortality. Not proof of what civilizations can build, but evidence of what civilizations can lose. The collapse was so complete that it erased not just the city, but the civilization that had created it, not just the buildings, but the knowledge that had made such buildings possible, not just the people, but the languages they had spoken and the ideas those languages had carried. It was erasure on a scale that makes individual death seem trivial by comparison, the death of an entire way of life, the extinction of an entire approach to organizing human communities, the disappearance of solutions to problems that the rest of the world would take thousands of years to solve independently, if they ever solved them at all. When British archaeologists rediscovered Mohenjo-Daro in the 1920s, brushing away millennia of accumulated dust and debris to reveal streets that ran straighter than most modern cities could manage, the world stood stunned before a revelation that rewrote everything historians thought they knew about the ancient past. Beneath the seemingly empty plains of Sindh lay not just another ruin, but proof of human capabilities that predated every other example of urban sophistication. Evidence of minds that had solved problems of city planning and public health that still challenged contemporary societies. A civilization as advanced as Mesopotamia or Egypt, but older than both, more sophisticated than either, more mysterious than anything archaeologists had ever encountered. And yet, despite decades of careful excavation, despite the application of every technique that modern archaeology could devise, it remained a stranger, an alien presence in the familiar narrative of human development, a civilization that seemed to have emerged from nowhere, achieved wonders that nobody else could match, then vanished so completely that even the memory of its existence had been erased. Their script remains undeciphered despite the efforts of linguists and codebreakers and computer programs that have successfully decoded every other ancient writing system ever discovered, thousands of symbols carved into seals and pottery and fragments of larger texts, clearly meaningful, obviously systematic, but locked away behind barriers that have proven more durable than the cities that created them. Messages that carry information we desperately need, names of rulers, records of laws, explanations of customs, accounts of the daily life that would help us understand how their society actually functioned, but written in languages that died so completely that even the key to reading them was lost. Words that might answer every question we have about who these people were and how they achieved what they achieved, but words that remain as silent as the ruins where they were found. Their rulers remain faceless shadows, if they had rulers at all, unlike every other ancient civilization that left behind statues and inscriptions and monuments designed to preserve the names and achievements of kings and queens and emperors. The Indus Valley peoples seem to have deliberately avoided the kind of self-aggrandizement that characterized their contemporaries. No pharaohs with their faces carved into mountainsides, no god kings with their exploits recorded in cuneiform tablets, no imperial dynasties with their genealogies preserved in stone and bronze. Just anonymous builders who created wonders and then disappeared without bothering to sign their work. Their gods remain nameless mysteries, if they worshipped gods as we understand the concept. The religious beliefs that motivated the construction of the Great Bath, that guided the ceremonies that must have taken place in structures we can map but cannot interpret, all of it erased as thoroughly as if it had never existed. Spiritual practices that may have been profound enough to sustain a civilization for nearly 1,000 years, but that left no trace except architectural hints that we lack the context to decode. Rituals that connected individual lives to cosmic purposes, but rituals whose meaning died with the last person who understood their significance. Even their true name is gone, lost in the silence that swallowed everything else about them. Mohenjo-Daro, the Mound of the Dead, is a title given by people who discovered the ruins without knowing what to call them. A name that describes what the city became, not what it was. A designation that emphasizes ending rather than beginning, death rather than life, archaeology rather than achievement. A label that captures our ignorance rather than their identity. What did they call themselves? What did they call their city when it was alive with the voices of children and the sounds of commerce and the rhythms of daily life that made it one of the largest urban centers on earth? What words did they use to describe their accomplishments when they gathered in the Great Bath or conducted business in markets whose organization we can map but whose purposes we cannot fathom? What language did they speak when they were planning the urban infrastructure that still impresses contemporary engineers, when they were developing the social systems that somehow achieved equality without sacrificing efficiency? No one knows. Perhaps no one ever will. The questions multiply like echoes in empty chambers, bouncing off walls that have forgotten how to answer. What was their story, and how did they manage to create something so advanced without leaving behind the kinds of records that every other major civilization considered essential? What caused their downfall, and why did it happen so suddenly that they left no accounts of their final days, no explanations of what went wrong, no warnings for future generations who might face similar challenges? Were they victims of the river that abandoned them, or the sky that stopped providing rain, or diseases that spread faster than understanding, or internal conflicts that tore apart social bonds that had seemed unbreakable? Or were they destroyed by something else entirely, something that we haven't considered because it falls outside the normal categories that historians use to explain the rise and fall of civilizations? No one can say with certainty. The evidence is insufficient. The witnesses are all dead. The records, if they ever existed, have been lost or destroyed or rendered unreadable by the passage of time that erases everything human hands create. And so Mohenjo-Daro lingers in our histories as both presence and absence, as proof of human capability and reminder of human limitation. Its ruins speak but do not answer. Its wells hold only dust and questions. Its great bath contains only silence and the weight of ceremonies whose purpose we can sense but cannot understand. Its streets still follow the geometric perfection that guided their original construction, but they lead nowhere except to more mysteries, more evidence of achievements we cannot fully comprehend. It stands as a monument to the fragility of human memory, to the ease with which entire civilizations can vanish so completely that their very existence becomes questionable, a reminder that greatness can disappear without a sound, leaving only archaeological fragments that raise more questions than they answer, that the most important conversations in human history may have been conducted in languages that no living person can speak, by people whose names no living person can pronounce, according to principles that no living person fully understands. The city that had mastered urban planning now serves as a warning about urban vulnerability. The civilization that had achieved sustainable prosperity now stands as evidence that sustainability is never guaranteed. The people who had solved problems that still challenge contemporary societies now exist only as anonymous builders of wonders we cannot fully appreciate because we cannot fully comprehend the context that made them possible. Their legacy is paradox. They achieved permanence through methods that were too permanent to be transmitted to future generations. They created durability through systems that were too durable to adapt when adaptation became necessary for survival. They built for eternity, but forgot that eternity includes change, that permanence must be flexible if it hopes to remain permanent. Their cities outlasted their civilization. Their engineering outlasted their culture. Their bricks outlasted their wisdom. And perhaps that is the most haunting lesson of all, that it is possible to solve technical problems while failing to solve the larger problem of ensuring that solutions survive the societies that create them, that it is possible to build things that last for millennia while building cultures that disappear within centuries, that the most sophisticated urban planning is useless if it cannot be adapted to meet challenges that were not anticipated when the plans were first drawn, that the most efficient social organization is fragile if it depends on conditions that are not guaranteed to remain stable, and perhaps, somewhere beneath the dust and silence, beneath the layers of sand and time that have accumulated over ruins that once housed tens of thousands of souls, the city still waits, not buried by natural forces that operated without intention, but buried by silence that accumulated around secrets too important to be lost, too dangerous to be discovered, too profound to be understood by minds that have not learned to think in the same terms that guided the builders who created wonders and then vanished without explanation, waiting for archaeologists who are prepared to find more than artifacts, more than evidence, more than proof that ancient peoples were more sophisticated than we assumed, waiting for minds that are ready to encounter ideas about human organization that are so different from contemporary assumptions that they seem alien, revolutionary, threatening to systems that depend on inequality and competition and the individual accumulation of resources, waiting for the moment when silence breaks and reveals what it has been protecting all these centuries, what it has been hiding from civilizations that were not ready to learn what Mohenjo-Daro had to teach, what it has been preserving for the generation that would be wise enough to understand that some achievements are too important to be lost, even when they are too dangerous to be remembered. The city in the dust still dreams of the day when dust will be brushed away not just from bricks and pottery and fragments of everyday life, but from ideas and principles and ways of organizing human communities that could transform the contemporary world if we were brave enough to learn from people who solve problems we are still struggling with, still dreams of the day when the silence breaks, and the dead city teaches the living world how to build civilizations that are designed to last, not just as ruins that archaeologists can study, but as living examples of what human cooperation can achieve when it is guided by wisdom rather than ambition, by understanding rather than force, by the patient application of principles that serve everyone rather than the impatient accumulation of advantages that serve only the few. The mound of the dead still contains life. The silence still contains voices. The mystery still contains answers, but only for those who are prepared to listen with more than their ears, to see with more than their eyes, to understand that some civilizations disappear not because they failed, but because they succeeded too completely for their contemporaries to recognize their achievements as achievements rather than threats. Mohenjo-Daro waits, in dust and silence, in questions and mystery, in the space between what we know and what we need to know, and it will continue waiting until we are ready to learn what it has been trying to teach us for 4,000 years. That civilization is possible, that cooperation works, that cities can be planned and societies can be organized, and human communities can flourish according to principles that serve everyone rather than exploit everyone. That the future we dream of building has already been built. We just forgot how to read the blueprints. We just lost the ability to speak the language. We just buried the memory under so much dust and silence that we convinced ourselves it was only a dream. But dreams don't leave archaeological evidence. Dreams don't build drainage systems that still function after millennia. Dreams don't organize cities according to geometric principles that modern urban planners study and admire. Dreams don't solve problems of public health and social organization that contemporary societies are still struggling to address. Mohenjo-Daro was real. It worked. It lasted for nearly 1,000 years, and somewhere in its silence, its memory, its carefully preserved ruins, the instructions for building it again still wait. Still wait for us to stop making excuses about why cooperation is impossible, why equality is impractical, why planning for the collective good is unrealistic. Still wait for us to admit that the problems we think are unsolvable have already been solved by people whose names we cannot pronounce, in a language we cannot read, according to principles we have convinced ourselves we cannot understand. But understanding is a choice, and Mohenjo-Daro, the city in the dust, the mound of the dead, the civilization that vanished without explanation, still offers to teach us how to choose differently if we are finally ready to learn.